Okay, let's dive right in. It's pretty wild to think about, but a century ago, India's population actually shrank. I mean, it literally went backward. Yet today it's one of the most massive demographic forces on the entire planet. In this explainer, we're going to explore the true story behind a century of explosive growth and uncover exactly how these shifting numbers are shaping the future of an entire nation.
But before we get into the historical nitty gritty, we really have to ask ourselves, how exactly does a country, physically, economically, and socially, manage a rapidly expanding population over the span of 100 years? I mean, population isn't just some static number sitting on a page, right? It's this incredibly dynamic force that shapes the physical, economic, and social reality of a nation. And to truly grasp this, we need to understand the immense scale we're dealing with.
Just to set the scale here, and we really need to wrap our heads around this, the 2011 census revealed that India's population had reached a staggering 121.02 crores. That's over 1.2 billion people. To put that into perspective, that number officially made India the second most populous nation in the entire world at the time, right behind China. When you have 17.5% of the world's population living on just 2.4% of the world's land area, understanding exactly how India got to this massive number is absolutely crucial. So, how do we track a century of explosive growth? Well, we can basically break this massive century down into six distinct phases. Think of it as a clear, chronological roadmap of India's growth from 1911 all the way to 2011. It starts with a surprising marginal decline, moves through a period of steady positive growth, literally skyrockets into a population explosion, and finally shows signs of a recent slowdown. Now, when we actually crunch the numbers and track the data decade by decade, a very clear pattern emerges. We're talking about a continuous, steady climb in both the total population and the annual growth rate. But if we rewind to the very beginning of the timeline, between 1911 and 1921, there's one glaring anomaly that completely breaks the entire pattern. Get this. In the decade of 1911 to 1921, the population didn't just stall out, it actually shrank. We're talking about a negative average annual growth rate of minus 0.03%. The total population literally experienced a marginal decline, dropping from 25.2 crores down to 25.1 crores. Now, obviously, this marginal decline wasn't exactly by choice, and it certainly wasn't due to family planning. It was a deeply tragic era driven by the devastating spread of epidemics. Back in this early pre-industrialized stage, India just didn't have widespread medical facilities. So diseases like influenza, cholera, plague, and malaria just swept through the country, causing a devastatingly high death rate that temporarily outpaced births. Because the population continuously, and I mean continuously increased every single decade after this point, the 1921 census officially earned a pretty dramatic title. Demographers call it the Year of Great Divide. It is the precise historical marker where India's population trajectory flipped from fluctuating to permanently upward. As we march forward in time past that Great Divide, we see a steady, positive 1 to 1.3% growth rate leading up to independence. But then, well, starting around 1951, that growth just swells into a tremendous post-independence population boom. We're talking a jump from 36.1 cores to an absolutely incredible 54.8 cores by 1971. Imagine the sheer physical strain of this kind of growth. Think about a typical street back in 1961. The population felt, relatively manageable. There was space. Fast forward 50 years, and you're suddenly dealing with the overflowing, incredibly crowded realities of the modern era. This perfectly captures what demographers call the next major phase. So, the crucial takeaway here is that between 1971 and 2001, India officially entered an era of population explosion. For 3 straight decades, the annual population growth rate consistently surpassed 2%. And just to clarify, a population explosion is basically a situation where the growth of the population is fundamentally faster than the growth and development of the economy. And that leads to immense, almost unimaginable pressure on land, infrastructure, and the food supply. Okay, let's pause the timeline right here, because we really have to ask, why did this happen? Well, it was essentially a perfect storm. We're talking about the collision of deeply rooted social factors keeping the birth rate very, very high, happening at the exact same time that modern medical miracles were pushing the death rate completely through the floor. You see, the economic and social structures of the time naturally incentivized having larger families. For starters, the legal marriage age was historically much lower. Plus, with traditional joint family systems, individual financial burdens were shared across the whole family, which kind of lowered the perceived economic cost of having another child. Add in the heavy reliance on human manpower for agriculture, where more kids meant more hands in the field, and a widespread ignorance of family welfare services, and you've got a surefire recipe for persistently high birth rates.
This whole dynamic is a textbook example of the demographic transition theory in action. If you track the trends, as medical care improves, the death rate rapidly plummets right after the 1920s. But the birth rate? That takes much, much longer to start coming down. That massive, widening gap in the middle, that right there is your population explosion. It's actually a fascinating paradox, right? This explosive population growth was, in reality, caused by incredible victories in human welfare. The death rate didn't just fall by magic. It fell because widespread medical facilities practically eradicated those old epidemics. It fell because maternal mortality declined. It fell because infant mortality dropped dramatically, down to just 47 per thousand by 2011. And it fell because of huge improvements in nutrition, like rolling out midday meals in schools. Literally, saving lives caused the population to boom. Which finally brings us to the most recent chapter in our century-long arc. The data from recent decades shows a definitive slowdown. From a growth rate of 1.9% in 2001, it dropped down to 1.4% in 2011. This really proves that increased literacy, widespread education, especially among women, and a rising overall standard of living are finally kicking in to curb that average annual growth, bringing the birth and death rates into a much closer balance.
So, with our century-long timeline complete, we kind of have to rethink the whole narrative here. Because a massive population of over 1.2 billion people isn't just some story about strained infrastructure or crowded cities. Ultimately, it's about human potential. Nature's bounty really only matters when people are there to turn it into something useful.
And that brings us to a really vital economic concept called the demographic dividend. Basically, a demographic dividend is this massive competitive advantage that happens when a country has a very high proportion of working-age people compared to dependents. It means that healthy, educated, and motivated people aren't just extra mouths to feed. They are a nation's absolute greatest asset, totally capable of driving massive economic growth and productivity.
The growth rate is finally slowing down, sure, but the Indian workforce is reaching absolutely unprecedented numbers. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this ultimate question to ponder. Will this monumental population be remembered historically as an economic burden? Or will the power of education and human development turn it into the ultimate competitive advantage on the global stage?